Hey everyone, welcome to the Megyn Kelly Show. I'm Megyn Kelly. In December, we brought you 5 episodes of a special series devoted to the quadruple murders in Idaho and the arrest of suspect Bryan Kohberger. The response we received was overwhelming in emails sent to me at Megyn, M-E-G-Y-N, at megynkelly.com, in comments on YouTube and our other social platforms and the Apple reviews. We were very grateful to hear from all of you, and we're very glad that you enjoyed it so much. Many of the comments we received were requests for more coverage, a little further digging into outstanding issues around this case. These questions are what inspired this 6th episode in our series. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe to this show on YouTube and follow me on Insta, Facebook, and X. Let's discuss a crucial aspect of your financial health, your credit report. It's time to face a hard truth. Your credit report could be suffering due to unfounded, reputation-damaging claims. These are the kind of claims that simply won't hold up under rigorous scrutiny if only you would provide that scrutiny of said claims. And that is where Lexington Law Firm comes into play. For less than $100, Lexington Law champions your cause using a comprehensive arsenal of consumer protection laws to fight for your best credit report. Lexington Law is fully equipped to challenge those exploitative creditors and aggressive debt collectors who obstruct your financial path. Go and visit lexingtonlaw.com for a complimentary credit assessment. Let their experts place your credit under the microscope, these are friendlies, ensuring that it reflects your true financial story. Remember to mention that I sent you here, Megyn Kelly. Again, that's lexingtonlaw.com to empower yourself with the right team on your side. First, as a refresher, on November 13th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were stabbed to death shortly after 4 a.m. in their 3-story home. Those students were Ethan Chapin, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, and Maddie Mogan. These were horrific, brutal murders, up close, personal, and completed in the span of less than 20 minutes. 2 other surviving roommates, Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen, were home at the time. We would later learn that Dylan Mortensen told police she saw an intruder in the home that night, a man who was wearing a COVID-style face mask and who she described as having bushy eyebrows. Approximately 6 weeks after the murders, an arrest. The suspect, 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger, a graduate student at nearby Washington State University, getting his PhD in criminology. He was taken into custody back at his family home in Pennsylvania in the Poconos and charged with all 4 murders. In our earlier episodes, we went through the arrest, Kohberger's past, his disturbing online writings, the prosecution and defense cases, and much more. Before we get to your questions, we begin with where the trial stands as of now in February 2024. We do not expect this trial to happen anytime soon, and it might not even happen in Idaho, where the crimes took place. On January 31st, Kohberger's lawyers filed a change of venue request, arguing the, quote, extensive inflammatory pretrial publicity, end quote, could damage their client's chances of a fair trial. The request says that a, quote, fair and impartial jury cannot be found in Latah County due to the area not having a large enough population center to avoid bias in the community. At a motions hearing the week before, Latah County Prosecutor Bill Thompson pushed back on the notion that the venue must be changed. He said the case was everywhere, meaning a change of venue wouldn't have any effect. He argued that they owed it to the people in that county to at least attempt to seat a jury here first, as he put it. At that hearing, we got a clue about when the trial might take place. The prosecutors would like it to begin this summer of 2024. So sometime around June, when the university students are mostly no longer in town. Kohberger's public defender, Ann Taylor, however, said that timeline was not realistic in any way. She said if the venue does not change, she will be pushing for a start date of summer 2025. So for now, we wait, although we do have one noteworthy date. On June 25th, 2024, famed journalist and author Howard Bloom's new book on Kohberger and this quadruple murder will be released by HarperCollins. It's called When the Night Comes Falling, a requiem for the Idaho student murders. Bloom's reporting on this story for Air Mail News has been fantastic. His writing, captivating. We used it as part of our 5-part series back in December. And from what I know about the book, he has much more new reporting coming out. And when the book hits, we will have Bloom on to talk about it all. But now we want to get to your questions. One of the most asked questions that we received was about the biggest development in the case, which happened after we aired the series. On December 28th, almost exactly 1 year to the day that police arrested Kohberger, University of Idaho officials demolished the house at 1122 King Road where the murders took place. The demolition began early in the morning and was completed within 2 hours. Police were on hand to monitor the process. University President Scott Green said, quote, "It's time for the house's removal and to allow the collective healing of our community to continue." But before the trial, what if the jury wants to see the house themselves? He also noted that both the prosecution and the defense were given access to the house, which they did take the university up on, and that neither side requested that the home be retained. Last month in episode 695 on the Megyn Kelly Show, I talked to Nancy Grace about this decision.
I can't believe they did this. I can't believe that the interest of the beautification of the campus outweighed the interest of justice. Now, I think that it's a major mistake because very often it's alleged police wrongdoing, whether it's some sort of misconduct or the gathering of evidence. I think it's really important that the jury be able to see what happened and then combine it as an overlay with whatever was on the body cams. So they know that there was no police wrongdoing, no planting of evidence, so to speak. I would like them to see the room where that knife sheath was found bearing Bryan Kohberger's DNA in the snap.
2 of the victims' families were vehemently opposed to the demolition and did object. The loved ones of Kaylee Gonsalves and Xana Kernodle speaking out before the house was torn down. Quote, "There may be additional discovery by either party that prompts one side or the other to go back to the scene of the crime." That was from the Gonsalves family in a statement. Quote, "Jurors are notoriously unpredictable, and they tend to make decisions on a variety of facts and circumstances. It would be foolish of us to try and foresee what they will want or need to make a just verdict in this case," end quote. One family was supportive of the demolition, Ethan Chapins. He was a triplet, and both of his siblings still attend the University of Idaho. Can you imagine them having to go buy the house? His parents said getting rid of this house was for the good of the university and for the community of Moscow. Many of you wrote in to ask also about the DNA evidence. Remember, as far as we know, the police found just a single tiny sample of touch DNA, which is not the best form of DNA. They found it on the knife sheath found next to one of the victims and were able to match that touch DNA to Kohberger using something called investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. They traced the DNA by matching it to someone in the Kohberger family, then zeroed in on Bryan Kohberger after realizing that it likely came from a relative of a man named Michael Kohberger, Bryan's dad, who cops then obtained DNA from. Actually, they went through his garbage, which is legal, and figured out that there was some sort of a match. They actually at that point could tell that Michael's son was a match to the touch DNA. One viewer, Bill, asked us over email, how did Bryan leave no DNA at the crime scene? Not one of his hairs? Not any of his saliva or blood? It's a good question. It was just one dot of touch DNA on the knife sheath snap. That's it? In a crime this gruesome and bloody? We're wondering the same thing. Scott, another viewer, added, given the reports that Kaylee Gonsalves appeared to have fought back during the attack, he writes, quote, there must be some DNA under fingernails. Where is it? If she didn't scratch him, did she pull his hair? There should be hair strands. If she didn't pull his hair, did she punch him? There should be a DNA transfer onto the knuckles of her hand. I just don't see any way, he says, that someone could actively resist in such a way that there would not be any DNA of the perpetrator. Others asked about the apparent lack of DNA in Kohberger's car, Bryan Kohberger's car, while some emailed wondering about reports that DNA from other males had been found at or around the scene of the crime. We're going to take these questions one by one. First, we should clarify that the police at this point are no longer relying on just the genetic genealogy match from Kohberger's father. As soon as Bryan Kohberger was arrested, his cheek was swabbed, and that DNA sample was tested against the touch DNA on the knife sheath, according to the police affidavit. The police adding it is no longer a question that it was Bryan Kohberger's touch DNA on that knife sheath. As for Bill's questions about the DNA at the crime scene, that is a mystery. As far as what's been reported, there was no other DNA of Bryan Kohberger's found at the scene or on any of the bodies. I know, it's hard to believe. Maybe there is, and they just haven't told us. The prosecutors might have more, but so far, neither the prosecution nor the defense is saying there's anything more than this touch DNA. This is going to be a big question at trial, but all reports we have seen so far point to the DNA on the knife sheath as being the prime, and it appears for now the only evidence that will be presented to the jury when it comes to DNA. Remember, it's believed that the killer, Kohberger, allegedly wore protective clothing, a mask, and probably, almost certainly, gloves. Then there's the question about the lack of DNA in Kohberger's car. That one has a bit more of an explanation. Kohberger was arrested more than 6 weeks after the murders took place. He drove that car across the country with his father, Michael, going home for Christmas break 1 month after the murders. While in Pennsylvania, reports are he was seen getting the car cleaned, including one report saying he had used bleach. All of this is believed to have happened while cops had their eye on Kohberger, but before they could get their hands on the car itself. It's possible that the cops went and retrieved some clues or discovered some evidence from the facility where Kohberger cleaned the car, like after he left. But if they did that, it hasn't been made public. If they did not do that, then it appears to be the case that they watched him clean the car, potentially destroying evidence, and did zero about it. The car is in police custody now, and they may have found DNA evidence that has not been publicly disclosed. They're definitely ripping that car apart. We doubt it, however, because the defense is saying publicly that the police found no DNA in the car. The question about the other male DNA found at and around the house is an intriguing one. All right, this is one of the other questions, as I mentioned. In a June 23 filing, one of Kohberger's defense attorneys, J. Weston Logsden, wrote about the existence of other male DNA found at the scene. Now, keep in mind, this is a defense lawyer. Here's how he described things. Quote, by December 17th, 2022, lab analysts were aware of 2 additional males' DNA within the house where the deceased were located, and another unknown male DNA on a glove found outside the residence on November 20th, 2022. To this date, the defense is unaware of what sort of testing, if any, was conducted on these samples, other than the STR DNA profiles. Further, these 3 separate and distinct male DNA profiles were not identified through CODIS, leading to the conclusion that the profiles do not belong to Mr. Kohberger, end quote. CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System, which is a national DNA database maintained by the FBI. If you're a criminal and they've tested you, you're probably in there. The defense is claiming the other male DNA samples were not ever identified and therefore do not belong to their clients. So who are these other males? You can bet the defense is going to make something of this at trial. Why didn't you investigate? Could that have been a suspect? We don't know who these other males are. Other than to say the police, the FBI, the prosecutors, they obviously believe they're not related and that they have the right man under arrest, the sole killer in this gruesome crime. Okay, back to that same filing and defense attorney Logsden. Quote, There is no connection between Mr. Kohberger and the victims. There is no explanation for the total lack of DNA evidence from the victims in Mr. Kohberger's apartment, office, home, or vehicle. In essence, through the lack of disclosure and their motion to protect the genetic genealogy investigation, the state, this is again the defense lawyer claiming this, is hiding its entire case, end quote. He goes on from there. The state apparently thinks that they need not explain how they came to think that it was Mr. Kohberger's DNA on the sheath. Presumably, the defense is expected to accept at face value that the sheath had touched DNA just waiting for testing by all the FBI's myriad resources. Additionally, the defense is to guess whether the state focused its investigation on Mr. Kohberger via a bizarrely complex DNA tree experiment, end quote. You can see what they're doing here, right? Planting doubts. What's genetic genealogy? Is it reliable? Why can't we get more info? We need to know more. This whole thing stinks. The defense continues. The state appears to be trying to hide its original domino such that Kohberger cannot discover why he was targeted. Mr. Kohberger has the right to discover and question the investigation that led to him, end quote. Okay, so you can now see the defense is opening a very interesting line of attack. They are implying the police may have planted the DNA on the knife sheath, put thereby, as they write, quote, someone else during the investigation. We also get an indication about the way they plan to knock down the entire concept of investigative genetic genealogy, describing it as a, quote, bizarrely complex DNA tree experiment. They seem to want to argue that if that first domino in the trail to Kohberger was not reliable or was the product of junk science, all evidence resulting from that domino would be rendered inadmissible. Quote, fruit of the poisonous tree. That's what we used to call it in criminal procedure. And if the tree is poisonous and can't be allowed in evidence, neither can its fruit. That's how they'll try to get out the DNA swab of Kohberger's cheek, fruit of the poisonous tree. For context, here's a bit from my interview with Cece Moore. She is the expert on the practice of IgG, and she was on the show in January of last year in episode 470. Watch how she breaks down the way this works. It's used all the time these days. The way she and her team have been able to make hundreds of successful IDs of violent criminals.
So we get the unknown individual's DNA from the crime scene. It might be semen, blood, saliva, even touch DNA. So it goes to a private lab where it is analyzed, and just like they would analyze it at, say, Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, we need it to be compatible with those profiles because that's the type of profiles we're going to compare against. And then it goes to our bioinformaticists, our scientists. Now, because these are degraded, mixed, contaminated samples, these are not like if you spit in the tube and you have this perfect DNA sample. These are non-optimal samples. And so we need something called bioinformatics that work with that degraded DNA to try to repair it, upload it to GEDmatch and or family tree DNA. It's compared against all the people there that are opted into law enforcement matching. And we get a list of matches. And we can predict what the likely relationships are based on how much DNA someone is sharing with that unknown person.
You see, so they get a match maybe to somebody in the Kohberger family. We can tell you this touch DNA relates to somebody in the Kohberger family who gave their DNA to one of these services. But, you know, Bryan Kohberger's not in there. Maybe not even Michael Kohberger. We don't know who it is. And then somebody like Cece Moore starts pulling wedding announcements and funeral announcements and family histories and anything she can get her hands on to try to zero in on which Kohberger. What does the family tree look like? And how can I follow the tree down to the most likely person who's got a connection to Idaho? It's a very complex and fascinating means of crime detection. She's been doing it for some time now, and she's been solving tons of cases. So they got close enough to realize we should check out the DNA of Michael Kohberger, the dad. They legally got his garbage and figured out from that this guy, Michael Kohberger, is the father of our suspect. He's only got one son, hence Bryan. Now, they had other evidence that led to Bryan. It's not all based on this touch DNA, but it would be a huge win if the defense can get the touch DNA thrown out. Huge. So we will see eventually what the prosecution has exactly when it comes to DNA. Is it just the touch? Is it more? And ultimately, whether it is admissible. For whatever it's worth, our lawyers, our legal experts we've talked to on the show, believe it will be admitted, notwithstanding these objections to IgG. But one of the many things we just don't know yet. When we come back, a look at some of your questions related to the 6 students at the center of the case and how some early language by the cops may have opened up a rabbit hole for the internet that made the speculation about this case run wild. We'll be right back. This President's Day, honor the legacy that shaped America with AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. At AMAC, they celebrate the courage and leadership that built our nation. In honor of President's Day, enjoy their exclusive sale, becoming a 5-year AMAC member for just $35. That's right, $35 for 5 years. As a member, enjoy benefits tailored for mature Americans, resources, exclusive discounts, trusted news, games, sweepstakes, and a powerful voice for your rights. Visit amac.us/Megyn for this special President's Day offer during the month of February. Seize the opportunity to be a part of a community valuing experience, wisdom, and principles that make America strong. Head to amac.us/Megyn and secure your 5-year membership for $35 today. AMA say, AMAC, better for you, better for America. Get ready for President's Day with the Association of Mature American Citizens. Visit amac.us/Megyn. One of the commentators on our YouTube channel wanted to know more about the roommates who survived. I'm with you. Me too. Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen. These are the 2 women who were not attacked and survived the evening. He writes, quote, "There is something not right with the roommates calling friends before 911 when they discovered the scene." Yeah, I agree. Something's strange about that. Others asked about the possibility of texts between the 2 surviving roommates during the murders, or at least before the 911 call that was placed at noon the next day. I mean, that day, but later, several hours after the 4 a.m. murders. Here's what we know. The affidavit makes very clear that Dylan Mortensen encountered someone during, we believe, right after the murders. As a reminder, here's what we learned, and the initials DM refer to Dylan. Quote, this is from the affidavit. DM stated she originally went to sleep in her bedroom on the southeast side of the 2nd floor. DM stated she was awoken at approximately 4 a.m. by what she stated sounded like Gonsalves playing with her dog in one of the upstairs bedrooms, which were located on the 3rd floor. A short time later, DM said she heard who she thought was Gonsalves saying something to the effect of, "There's someone here." DM stated she looked out of her bedroom but did not see anything when she heard the comment about someone being in the house. DM stated she opened her door a second time when she heard what she thought was crying coming from Xana Kernodle's room. DM then said she heard a male voice say something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." DM stated she opened her door for the 3rd time after she heard the crying and saw a figure clad in black clothing and a mask that covered the person's mouth and nose walking towards her. DM described the figure as 5 foot 10 inches or taller, male, not very muscular, but athletically built with bushy eyebrows. The male walked past DM as she stood in a, quote, frozen shock phase. The male walked toward the back sliding glass door. DM locked herself in her room after seeing the male, end quote. There's more, of course, in the affidavit, but why the roommates waited until nearly noon to call the police remains a complete mystery. And it's also true, as has been reported, that it was a friend who called the cops, a friend who was at the house because they had been called by the surviving roommates before the roommates called the police themselves. All right, so Dylan was allegedly in a frozen shock phase until the next day. And then what happened? Did she come out and see the bodies? Did she just call a friend immediately? And then the friend came over and saw the bodies and called 911? Why don't we know this chronology? Why wouldn't the police make this clear? There's something strange about the whole story and what's been disclosed. We don't know what the truth is behind all of this, but we do expect both of those roommates to be called to the stand at trial. That will be absolutely critical and probably one of the most watched moments of this entire thing. The question of whether the surviving roommates were texting one another during the murders, that's actually very interesting. Or maybe the next morning before or while they were discovering the crime scene. Howard Bloom reported that Kaylee Gonsalves's father, Steve, heard through a source that this question about possible text between these two came up in the grand jury proceedings. But we don't know whether that's true. We don't know whether it did in fact come up at the grand jury, and we don't know whether in fact there was texting. The police certainly do have their cell phone records, and if there were texts, we're going to know, but we have to wait till the trial. Then there are some questions from YouTube commenters that we can put into a category of, well, we'll call it extreme skepticism. One person asked about reports that the, quote, house was regarded as a drug house throughout the campus, or the fact that there were group chats that knew something happened there well before they even called it in, end quote. Others asked about Chapin's fraternity and the rumors that there was a potential fight there that night that may have been connected to the murder somehow. There's no evidence of that. No evidence of a fight at the fraternity, at least not right now. It appears that those are just unsubstantiated rumors. Ethan's former fraternity brothers spoke out in November about him to KTVB in Idaho. Watch here.
Coolest guy you'll ever meet. That's about it right there.
He was a really big, funny, happy guy.
When someone would walk in the room, like not just me, anybody, he would welcome you into the room.
He was always very kind in everything that he did.
He always would call me Gussie Gus in his little raspy voice.
You know, emotionally, always there for people.
These guys at Sigma Chi dealing with a tragedy they never foresaw, I'm sure, when they entered the fraternity and campus. The questions about the shadiness of this house on King Road where the murders took place, as some described it, or even questions that we received about whether a specific roommate may have been the intended victim, all of that, we believe, can be traced back to the way the cops originally talked about this crime. From the very start, the police described the killings as, quote, targeted.
Based on details at the scene, we believe this was an isolated, targeted attack on our victims.
Even the mayor described it that way in this interview just days after the murders with Good Morning America.
I think from the evidence that exists on site, the conclusion was fairly straightforward that this was targeted, isolated, doesn't pertain to any other location or any other individuals in the city.
It's very strange. How did they know that? On what were they basing that? They said nothing more. This targeted language continued for weeks. One state police spokesperson told the Daily Mail it's possible all 4 victims could have been targeted by the killer. Prosecutor Bill Thompson told a local news outlet, quote, investigators believe that this attack was intended for a specific person, end quote. Why did they keep saying that over and over and over? Moscow Police Captain Roger Lanier said, quote, we've told the public very clearly from the beginning that we believe it was a targeted attack. To be honest, you're going to have to trust us on that at this point because we're not going to release why we think that, end quote. And indeed they didn't. But by early December, the tune changed. Moscow police put out a statement attempting to clarify a miscommunication, saying, quote, detectives do not currently know if the residents or any occupants were specifically targeted, but continue to investigate. Come on. With no acknowledgement of the number of times you've said that and why, no explanation of why. I get that they don't want to undermine the case at trial, but this is just too glaring. I mean, what does this language even mean, targeted or specifically targeted? The confusing mixed messages in the early weeks of the case led to intrigue among many, including true crime watchers. And undoubtedly, many of the theories that have emerged and continue to percolate online are due to this very unclear framing by the cops from the outset. Did he know them? Did he want to be with them? Did he post on their social media all these questions, some of which we've addressed in the earlier episodes. Meantime, we know the house on King Road was a known party spot. And according to Howard Bloom's reporting, the neighborhood where the house was located was known to be an area where drug dealing did take place. Okay, what about Kohberger's family and the mystery around the autopsies? That's next. Let me tell you a story about a guy named Leo Grillo. Leo was on a road trip and came across a Doberman. This dog was severely underweight and clearly in trouble. Leo rescued him and named him Delta. Sadly, Delta was just one of many animals that needed help, and this inspired Leo to start Delta Rescue, the largest no-kill, care-for-life animal sanctuary in the world. They've rescued thousands of dogs, cats, and horses from the wilderness, and they provide their animals with shelter, love, safety, a home. Dedication and everlasting love to animals, that is Leo's mission and legacy. Delta Rescue relies solely on contributions, and if you want caring for these animals to be part of your legacy, speak with your estate planner because there are tax benefits too. You can grow your estate while letting your love for animals live well into the future. Check out the estate planning tab on their website to learn more and speak with your advisor. We call a dog man's best friend for a reason. You can help those who need it most. Visit deltarescue.org today to learn more. That's deltarescue.org. One of our listeners wanted to know why we did not mention that one of Kohberger's sisters, upon hearing about the murders in the town adjacent to where her brother was getting a graduate degree, immediately wondered if he was the guy. What caused his sister to think that? Wrote in our listener. Another wrote in, if Kohberger's sisters were fired simply by association, that's terrible. I'd like to think they'd be that much more of a counselor because they had had to see or deal with Kohberger and his struggles and demons. Look, to that latter point, it does feel like guilt by association, but I don't know. The one sister's a therapist, and I can see how it might be tough for someone, let's say the victim of domestic violence, to keep going for therapy from a woman whose face and name just reminds you of one of the most violent, gruesome crimes in recent memory. The whole thing is fraught. It's not fair, but it's fraught. News Nation did report that both sisters were fired from their jobs shortly after Kohberger's arrest. Watch.
I have now learned that Kohberger's two sisters have both lost their jobs since the murders and were let go because of their relationship with their brother, Bryan Kohberger. Kohberger's older sister was a school counselor, and we know his younger sister, at one point at least, was working as an actress. Both of Kohberger's parents are retired, and I'm told the family is in very, very bad shape financially right now, especially because the sisters are now unemployed.
On the first point about Kohberger's sister suspecting her brother, that first question that was raised, it was in fact reported by NBC's Dateline. That was the only outlet that had this info. They had a source who told them Kohberger's sisters did wonder whether it was their brother who had something to do with those murders in Idaho. Oh, watch.
According to our source, investigators learned the following. One of Bryan's two older sisters, home for the holidays, brought up an uncomfortable topic. The sister had noticed Bryan had been wearing latex gloves. She thought it odd. And at some point, the sister, quite loudly, pointed out that at the time of the murders in Moscow, Bryan had lived just a few miles away in Pullman, and that Bryan drove a white Elantra, a car that law enforcement across the nation was looking for. Add that to the gloves, and the sister said she thought the Kohberger family should consider that Bryan might have killed the four students in Moscow.
I mean, imagine being this sister, knowing about these horrific crimes, knowing that your brother, who by all accounts was a very, odd, disturbed guy, lived right there, has the same kind of car that they're looking for, and now he's back at home wearing latex gloves throughout the house. I'm sure she did suspect him. And there's probably some willful blindness by a family member to the harsh realities, but somehow it may have penetrated even that. I mean, Dateline did report that the sister went on to search his vehicle herself for potential evidence, but did not find any. They also reported that Kohberger's father defended his son at the time, but did Michael Kohberger suspect his son? Remember, it was the dad, Michael, who flew to Washington State to accompany Bryan on the lengthy cross-country trip back to the Poconos in Pennsylvania, just days before his arrest and about a month after the murders. And in a bizarre twist, we actually get to see the father and son on this road trip, not once but twice, in police body cam footage taken during traffic stops in Indiana along the route. We brought you some of this in episode 2, but when you start to really examine the stops while thinking about whether Michael suspected Bryan of the crime, it does cast a bit of a new light on what we're witnessing here. Take a look at this part of the conversation with the police officer.
What did you say about some SWAT team thing? Or
yeah, there was a mass shooting and everything. We don't know
where?
This was essentially prevents criminality.
Interesting.
Well, it's horrifying because he's going to the universe, you know what I mean?
It's hard to make out everything that's said, but Michael keeps talking about a scary crime scene back where their road trip started. Not the quadruple murder case in Idaho, but a SWAT standoff that turned deadly in Washington State more recently. On December 15th, just slightly more than a month after the Idaho murders, a man was killed on the WSU campus during a standoff with cops. On the evening of December 14th at approximately 8:30 p.m., police officers responded to a report of a weapon offense. According to the initial police news release, a man in his 30s was threatening to kill his roommates. Now, the roommates were safely removed, but while Pullman, Washington police officers attempted to speak with the man making the threats, he barricaded himself inside the apartment. Crisis negotiators and SWAT personnel had to respond to the scene. According to the police, quote, after unsuccessful negotiations, escalating behavior, and continued danger to the public and officers, the male was shot, end quote. This happened at 4:22 a.m. That man died at the scene. Now, the man turned out to be 36-year-old Bryan Kohberger, a Purple Heart recipient who, according to his friend, was suffering from mental illness after a possible traumatic brain injury from his time in Afghanistan. It's a sad and a strange story, but if you Google Bryan Kohberger and Bryan Kohberger, you could wind up down a rabbit hole for days on the internet. And while they lived near each other and have the same initials, there appears to be no connection between these two men, except that traffic stop, sort of, where Michael keeps bringing it up while sitting next to his son, Bryan. He seems uneasy. Maybe he's thinking of the criminology student he raised and the crimes in close proximity to where his son resided. Maybe even hoping that the dead man may have been responsible for that quadruple murder. Certainly not his son. Finally, we got several questions from our audience about the coroner's comments in this case and the autopsies. Some strange statements from her, a lack of information or unclear information when it comes to the bodies. Now, Kathy Mobbitt is the Latah County coroner, and she has been in this position for 16 years. Shortly after the murders, she spoke out to several news outlets. You don't often see that with the coroners, but here she is with NBC News 4 days after the victims were found.
It's pretty traumatic when there's 4 dead college students who have been stabbed to death in one location.
And to local news outlet KREM.
Well, there was a lot of blood. It's a very sad scene.
I don't like, when do you just don't see the coroner speaking out every day in the wake of these murders. Usually they leave it to a police spokesperson. It's a little strange, but also watch how she talks about the murder weapon.
You're ruling all 4 deaths homicides?
Yes.
Okay. And can you give us a manner of death? Yeah.
I believe that the press release was that they were from a sharp object. So
stabbings.
Yeah, we'll know more after the autopsies tomorrow.
She's citing a press release? I mean, okay, it might just be a person with very little media training, but then why would she be out there? Why did they put her out there? But her other actions drew some backlash from the family themselves. The lawyer for the Gonsalves family said that Mobbitt had made, quote, personal phone calls to some of the family and released a lot of information that investigators did not know about, end quote. Steve Gonsalves, Kaylee's father, told Fox News that Mobbitt was releasing an inappropriate amount of information to the families, like the specific injuries to the students done through personal phone calls to the families, he said. Again, I haven't heard of that, where the coroner is interacting directly with the families about the specific injuries as opposed to the police or the detective running herd on the investigation. Of course, this information has largely stayed out of the press. We have heard some details, like Kaylee's parents telling CBS in September what Mobbitt said about how Kaylee and Maddie were found.
The bed was up against the wall. The headboard was touching the wall, and the left side of the bed was touching the wall. And we believe that Maddie was on the outside and Kaylee was on the inside.
According to Coroner Mobbitt, the killer's first victim was Maddie, says Steve.
And then from Maddie, he moved on to your daughter. You believe she had awakened at that point?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, there's evidence to show that she awakened and tried to get out of that situation.
The way the bed was set up is what...
She was trapped.
She was trapped.
Some of the overall confusion likely came from how the four victims were described in the Kohberger arrest affidavit and the inconsistencies. All right, so let's walk through some of it. Xana Kernodle's injuries were described in the affidavit as being, quote, caused by an edged weapon. What does that mean? Like, why can't they say knife? What does that even mean? Of Kaylee and Maddie, they were, quote, visible stab wounds. Is that a distinction between an edged weapon? For Ethan Chapin, the section begins by saying he was, quote, deceased with wounds, later determined, end quote. And then there's a curious redaction before continuing, quote, caused by sharp force injuries. What's that? Even stranger, in that affidavit, Ethan's section references a date for the autopsy report as December 15th, 2022. And that's more than a month after the murders, and also nearly a month after the initial autopsies were reported to have taken place. What? This confusing inclusion led some to question whether there had been a second, later autopsy. We simply don't know. We don't believe there was, but we don't know. We also don't know the number of stab wounds on each victim, and typically they would release that. This is relevant to the timeline and, of course, the ferocity of the crime, which the prosecutors will want to introduce. Remember, prosecutors will try to prove that Kohberger committed these four murders in a short window of less than 20 minutes on two different floors of the house. The defense is going to want to argue it's impossible. And so even the defense may want to point out the number of stab wounds if it was high to try to say how could he possibly have done this? There had to be multiple people. Who were they? Where are the connections? All of that. Now, these details are sure to come out at trial, but as we told you at the beginning, that trial is not yet on the horizon. Until it is, we expect to get more. There will be more leaks and so on, but between now and then, we'll stay on it. We'll bring you the latest on this shocking and just tragic case. And you keep sending your excellent questions and comments to me. We have amazing amateur crime sleuths in our audience. You guys had such interesting and good, provocative, advancing the investigation type thoughts. And we learned a lot from you after, we reviewed your comments to our earlier episodes. The email is Megyn, MEGYN, at megynkelly.com. You can also post on our social media channels or go to the Apple reviews. We review and read all of them. And it actually helps the show if you post a review there. And while you're there, do us a favor and hit follow and download on the show. Listen, thanks for watching and for listening and for all of your thoughtful commentary.